In 2014, civil unrest in Ukraine led to an incursion by Russia and the annexation of Crimea, which the United States and Western European countries responded to with economic sanctions, a situation many feared could lead to a reignition of the Cold War, the nearly 50-year standoff between the Communist East and Democratic West. Troy Trojan Vision's panel of political science experts, joined by Troy's ambassador-in-residence, examined the present situation. In Ukraine 2016, Where Are We Now? The panelists include Dr. Jonathan Harrington, Director of the International Relations Program, who specializes in environmental politics and Chinese politics. He is the author of numerous articles and reviews. Dr. Michael O. Slobodchikoff specializes in relations between Russia and the former Soviet states, international conflict and peace, and comparative politics. He is the author of 2 books. Ambassador-in-Residence Connie Morella is a former 8-term member of the United States House of Representatives and the U.S. Ambassador to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And the moderator, Dr. G. Doug Davis, specializes in international relations, the Middle East, Europe, and contemporary philosophy. He is the author of numerous articles, reviews, and chapters.
Hi, thank you for joining us on our Ukraine panel, and I will start with Ambassador Morella. Thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
And I would like to ask you first, what role do personal relationships play in U.S.-Russian relations, and how can this help in Ukraine?
I think personal relationships are important, Dr. Davis, in any kind of a connection. I often think of John Donne, who said, "No man or woman or country is an island. We are all connected. We need each other so often." And I think that is the situation with Russia, the Ukraine, the United States, all of the countries of the European Union. I just think the personal element is critically important. It's what binds us together. I often say it's respect that's important, and then it's listening, and then learning, and leading.
Great, thank you, thank you. Dr. Harrington,
Yes.
what are China's interests when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, China and Russia are strategic allies. They, I think, see a marriage of convenience between the two of them to help balance the United States. And I think China appreciates Russia and its willingness to stand up to the United States and to Europe on the one hand, but I would also say that I don't think China likes the excessive violence or the actual annexation of territory in the Ukraine. That's just kind of not China's style. They're, I think, more oriented towards a kind of a softer approach. So, however, you know, China kind of has to put up with them. They are dependent on Russia for their arms supplies. They are dependent on Russia for oil, gas, other natural resources. But they're even more dependent on the United States and Europe for trade and investment. The depth of the relationship between the U.S. and China on the trade side is many, many, many times that of Russia and China. So I think they're trying to get a delicate balance going on there. They don't want to upset the Russians. At the same time, they'd like them to be restrained in their approach to Europe and the U.S.
Great, great. Dr. Slobodchikoff, my question for you is, what is Russia's perspective on the crisis in Ukraine?
To answer that, I'd like to take a step back quickly, and that is to look at what happened at the end of the Cold War. If you ask most Americans who won the Cold War, they will tell you the United States and the West did. If you ask most Russians who won the Cold War, they will say the Cold War ended. We didn't lose, it ended. We stopped fighting. And the reason I bring that up is because that's a very important concept, because they believe that they are still worthy of world respect on the world stage and should still have a voice. And so I think that their perspective on NATO expansion, on the withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty and on several other factors that have contributed to this is that they are not viewed as having respect on the world stage. So on the one hand, they feel threatened by the expansion of NATO, but even more important than that, I think they feel that they've lost respect. And so they feel very strongly that Ukraine is tied to them through culture and through the post-Soviet aspect, and that is their sphere of influence. And so they really don't want the U.S. and the EU to expand into NATO, into Ukraine, and to bother that special relationship that they feel that they have with the post-Soviet states.
Great. Okay.
You know, I could go back to your original question to me too, in terms of working together and why it's important to trust. And I can recall the fact that in 1960 was the Kettering Foundation program of U.S.-Russian relations, connections. How do we work together? That went on through the Cold War, and I guess the crisis was, or the culmination or fulfillment was when, like 1991, 1989, when the Soviet Union and so many other countries were created. But you know, it continues now. And as a matter of fact, it's now the Dartmouth Conference of the Kettering Foundation, and it's to try to bring together Russians and Americans who can honestly have trust in each other and listen and learn from each other and work out solutions. For instance, we are very unhappy with Putin because of Ukraine, but yet we need him for Syria, Russia.
Yeah.
So how do you work these things out? Only by working together. And this Dartmouth conference is continuing. As a matter of fact, they'll have a meeting in Russia in May.
And you'll be attending that, correct?
I will be attending
Yes.
with Dr. Given.
Yes, great.
Yes.
Great, excellent.
And if I can build
Please.
off what Ambassador Morella just said, I remember in 1989, Project Raft was another one of these organizations where they were river runners. There were both American river runners and Russian river runners that came to run the Grand Canyon, and they ran a river in Siberia as well. And it was to build these personal connections. And the idea was that the governments might disagree, but at the individual levels, we could find a common language. We could speak to each other. We could understand that. And as long as we could do that, then there was a way to move forward, and we wouldn't annihilate each other.
Great, excellent.
If I may add, you know, it is during times of high tension where we see these back channels becoming more important. I remember in the case of the Tiananmen Square massacre, where high-level contacts between the United States and China weren't possible. But these types of other organizations, non-government organizations, or certain issue areas that were not controversial, like environmental cooperation, continued. And communication continued. And you know, I think it helps to keep the relationship going, even though it may be difficult at the highest level to have direct communication for political reasons.
Great. I'd like now to turn to look at Western institutions. And tomorrow, the Netherlands are holding a referendum asking their voters whether or not to reject the EU accession agreement with Ukraine. In June, the British will have a vote on whether or not to exit the EU. If you look at France, Marine Le Pen's party will be, and the French elections will occur 1 year from now. If she is in fact elected, she will pull France out of both NATO and the EU. Hungary itself is also now reorienting itself, so it's now looking at developing a relationship with Russia or even Turkey, but to leave the EU. And if we look at the recent polls, they suggest that if Russia attacks a Baltic state, of all the NATO states in Europe, the only two where there'd be popular support to actually go to war would be Poland and England. The rest of the countries of the West would in fact not have enough popular support to support this conflict. So a question that I have is, if you look at the decline of Western institutions, how can we offer credible support to Ukraine and to help Ukraine get through this crisis?
Well, I think, Dr. Davis, you have just given a great history, contemporary lesson on what is happening in the world. And what it says to all of us is, hey, we better make sure that we're following and we are offering services and we have understanding and we're trying to work something out. Maybe it's soft power, smart power, or whatever, but I concur with your questions about the anxieties that we have with regard to the to EU, to Britain, the chair in the Netherlands, what's happening in France, and so we've got to be alert. And I think we've got to get our best forces together. I don't mean military forces. I mean cerebral forces together to reach out and to try to understand what we can do. I don't have an answer for any one of them. Maybe my colleagues do, in which case I'm going to market it. But I do think an understanding of it and being ready to help out in any way we can to foster what we hope will be the correct results. But let me have our gentlemen experts respond.
Well, I believe that's above my pay grade to answer, is the cop-out answer. But I think that certainly, as Ambassador Morella stated, the anxiety level is extremely high. I think that Putin is willing to play a long game and to see if he can't develop these fissures between these allies and traditional allies that we had throughout the Cold War period. And I think that he's willing to try and put these small breaks between them, because he realizes that if he plays the long game, that things will go back to being, if not normal, then a new normal that will settle in. And so I think that he's actively trying to create these pressures and willing to try and see it through. I think that the U.S. is extremely worried about this, and that's extremely important, that the U.S. needs to reach out to their allies and to work with them, absolutely, and to try and prevent this, because I think this is a crisis for Western institutions that they're facing. So, but I think that the pressures are there both domestically and internationally, from within the countries, in terms of the parties like Le Pen's party, for example, or the fact that the Brexit might happen, right? And the Dutch don't want to support the Ukrainian treaty in general. That's under we'll see how that vote goes tomorrow. But that's no guarantee either way as to how the Dutch are going to vote. And that will be the first very telling result as to whether or not the Allies will stick together.
Mm-hmm. Could I pose a question
Sure,
particularly
absolutely.
to our expert? With what we have just learned, the Panamanian information that came out with regard to Putin's connections in so many ways, with the fact that the economy in Russia is doing so poorly because of particularly because of energy, and the ruble has gone down in value.
Yes.
How come Putin seems to be still popular from what we read about polls, or is he? Maybe
Well,
not.
no, I think he is. I think that there is reason to believe that he is not as popular as he once was. There is Putin fatigue among the Russian populace, but there is no viable alternative to Putin. And so I think until a viable alternative develops, and he's working very hard to ensure that there isn't one, but I think until a viable alternative develops, I think that Putin will be around for the long term. And I don't think we want a viable alternative to Putin yet. And the reason I say that is because a viable alternative won't come from a democratically elected leader. It could come from a coup that will get rid of Putin if things get too bad in Russia. And we won't like the results of that. So that worries me very much, that could happen. In terms of the Panamanian papers that we just saw, I think that certainly worrisome for the West is about Ukrainian's President
Yes.
Poroshenko.
Yes.
And him, at the time when the war started in eastern Ukraine, shipping all of the money west and lining his own pockets. And the level of corruption in Ukraine doesn't speak very highly of a democratic transition in Ukraine. And so that's a crisis of legitimacy that I think they're going to have to face, and we as the United States among our allies are going to have to face, that it's not the shining example of democratic transition that we'd like it to be.
Thank you.
Great. Well, then let's turn to our next question. And the next question will be posed to Dr. Harrington. If we look at the words of George Kennan in 1998, he warned that Russia would become very much opposed to the West with the expansion of NATO. And recently, John Marsheimer has authored a piece that came out in Foreign Affairs that says the West is to blame, not Russia, for the situation in Ukraine. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm not sure if we are totally to blame that Putin decided to invade Ukraine and take over Crimea. I mean, he had some role in that. However, I can see how Russia has been looking at this change since the end of the Cold War, losing one area of control after another, and that the Ukraine was really kind of the line in the sand. After Ukraine, then what happens? So I think it is. It's not surprising that Putin has reacted in the way he has, but I wouldn't put all the blame on the United States or Europe. We have, I think, the EU, the US, we want to spread democracy around the world. We want to spread stable governance, and it is in that spirit that we are trying to embrace Ukraine as well, and countries like Georgia. And I think that's a good thing. And the Ukrainians in the long run would be better off if that was to happen. But maybe at this particular moment in time, maybe it wasn't the best choice of timing to be trying to embrace Ukraine.
Okay. Any other comments? Dr. Slobodchikoff, then, does Russia have a Monroe Doctrine? Does it have legitimate claims on Kiev?
I would argue that Russia has declared a Monroe Doctrine, or we might call it a Putin Doctrine, in terms of the post-Soviet space. So one of the things that Russia was willing to do was allow its influence in Eastern Europe to stop. Certainly it didn't want NATO to expand, and Gorbachev has since said that he understood the agreements between President Bush and Helmut Kohl at the time, that NATO would make sure that the transition between having two Germanys and one would be handled smoothly, but that NATO would not expand any further. And so he understood that to be the case. Once NATO expanded, Russia was in no position really to argue. They could argue vocally, but they couldn't resist it. But they put a line in the sand, and they told Western policymakers that do not come into the post-Soviet space. And so when Georgia happened, 2008, right? Georgia was promised NATO membership, even though Western Europe didn't want it. That I think that Georgia certainly felt, and it was promised at the NATO meetings, eventual membership. Russia really does not want that. And so 2008, we saw an example of how they resisted that. So I think absolutely there is a Monroe Doctrine at work, and the Monroe Doctrine is basically within the post-Soviet space.
Okay, great. Well, let's turn and ask a more broad question. How can the Ukrainian crisis be resolved? And I'll pose that to all three of you.
Would you like to start?
Well, a little bit of praying, reaching out. Well, how can it be resolved? I don't think we have any answer for that. But I think we need to pursue what little things we can do that are going to ultimately lead to peace and tranquility and working it out. And it doesn't help, as had been mentioned, the fact that the president of Ukraine was found to be, guilty of corruption and greed. I don't think that helps, but I think we can't give up. We can't give up. We've got to offer as whatever benefit, strength that we can. Would you add to that?
Let me add before you
Yes.
that if we look at Ukraine, it's a divided society. So
Yeah,
it's the
right.
West,
Society.
It is.
they speak Ukrainian,
Right.
they're Catholic, and on the East they speak Russian and they're Orthodox. And if you look at the past centuries, the last time Ukraine was independent before 1991 was in the 13th century. So we're talking, it's been occupied by most of the surrounding neighborhoods for a long time. If you look domestically at corruption, the 50 richest people in Ukraine own half of the economy. And so the depths of the problems, and in a place that really does not have a history of democratic norms, I would argue that I think that, in a sense, we could argue that the West failed in our ability to manage Ukraine a long time ago because we let this go without offering any correction or support. And maybe it's because Ukraine was such a small state that it could play off Russia and the United States, and it has. But it's done that in the way to protect its corruption, not instead to democratize or to become a developed state.
It is internally, it has been so divided. I was there in 2000, the end of 2007, and they had a Russian parade through the streets with the military garb and the statues, and you could then see evident all around you a division, an actual division.
Well, and I think that speaks to the way forward, and that is that I think both Russia and the United States need to recognize that Ukraine is a unique country, and I think that they could work towards a federal Ukraine with more regional autonomy to recognize the divide between them and to work together to provide that, as well as I think recognizing that Ukraine should never join NATO. Ukraine should never join the Russian version either, the customs union. Ukraine should be a buffer state and allowed to operate between the two, much like Finland did during the Cold War, as a neutral entity. And neither side is willing to accept Ukraine as a neutral entity. And until that happens, I don't think we'll see much resolution at all. But I think that Ambassador Morello is absolutely correct. We just need to keep moving forward. We need to have these lower levels, these individual to individual ties. We need to recognize where we can cooperate. Syria, Al-Qaeda is a common enemy. We've got ISIS as a common enemy. If we begin to cooperate in those areas, that will, through, as we saw with the founding of the EU, cooperation leads to more cooperation. And so if we begin to cooperate in these areas, eventually we'll get to where we can resolve this crisis. I don't think it'll be soon. I am not optimistic about that, but eventually maybe we'll settle into some form of recognition and cooperation.
I guess, I do think about the millions of Ukrainians who do want to be part of Europe. And should we forsake them? Or should great powers decide that their aspirations will be unfulfilled? So I think we need to keep that in mind. From a global great power perspective, it may seem to make sense to have this buffer state, but there are so many people, maybe the majority of Ukrainians, are looking towards Europe for a better life. And I can also speak a little bit about the Georgians as well. I think Georgia suffered terribly during the 2008 conflict with Russia, and they are terribly interested in having this European relationship and moving towards the West and being independent of Russia. And they've kind of been forsaken too, as dedicated as they have been to fighting for that and actually losing lives. They're stuck in between these great powers as well, and I don't think we should give up on them either.
But on the other hand, to play devil's advocate, I was on a panel with Mearsheimer recently, and we were discussing this very topic. And Mearsheimer said, okay, if they have that right, and certainly they do have that right, then if we're to support it, we have to be willing to provide military assistance to ensure it. Are we willing to do that? Are we willing to send American soldiers into Ukraine to ensure that they have that right to join Europe? Are we willing to have the country split into two countries and support Ukraine totally? Because once we do that, we've destroyed the country and it becomes a vassal state, essentially, that we need to rebuild like we did after the Second World War. And Russia will need to do the same thing with Eastern Ukraine. Are we willing to do that? Do we have the money to do that? Should that be our problem? Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying that is the alternative, right?
And the current strategy is not going to achieve that ultimate goal.
It's not.
We will, as you mentioned, as Mearsheimer mentioned, we're going to have to take a different approach, a more robust approach that is a risky approach as well to pursue that alternative.
Yeah. As of 2012, the U.S. had not one tank in Europe, so we're pivoting towards Asia. And the real problem for Ukraine, I think, is that this crisis is emerging right at the time when the U.S. is now much more concerned with the rising China. And so we are not going to put more military, we're not going to buttress Europe. I mean, and why should we when Europe can't buttress itself? Europe can't even defend its own borders right now, as we see with the Syrian refugees. And so the real crisis, I think, is you're right, that the people in Ukraine do not have self-determination. And that's a crisis anywhere in the world, because if we look at the foundational principles that were present in the U.S. world order following the Second World War, that was the fundamental principle, the right of self-determination. And if that's no longer a preeminent part of our foreign policy, and to be honest, it's always been subordinated to security. Security comes first. But if that's no longer a part of our security policy, then Ukraine is in trouble. And I think that the rise of China plays a big role in the limitation that we see with Ukraine. Now we're in the last minute, so I'd like to give everyone a final thought or final opportunity to speak.
I think about the fact that I was honored to serve as our ambassador to OECD in Paris, and we came about because of the Marshall Plan. And as we were talking about what should be done, I thought of the Marshall Plan, which assisted those nations after World War II, the family of nations, not by telling them exactly what they needed to do in their countries to become democratic, vibrant area, but let them decide. And I think in some way, and I know this is tangential, in some way if we could be looking at some of these other countries that way. We are there to help you. We will give you expertise. We will give you technology that you need, but you must do the figuring out, and we'll help guide. So maybe some element of the Marshall Plan might still be applicable.
Great. That's a great way to conclude. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for watching our panel. And thank you for Trojan Vision.